"I don't need your ideal husband validation," she jeered, "until I gave that validation to someone else and—" The air in the grand ballroom of the Zenith Tower didn't just feel expensive. It smelled of success, a sharp blend of aged scotch, imported lilies, and the kind of perfume that cost more than my monthly car payment. This was Grace's habitat, the gleaming, high-altitude ecosystem where she, the newly promoted director of strategic partnerships, truly thrived. I, Thomas, her husband of 7 years, was essentially a well-dressed piece of decorative foliage in this environment, necessary for the backdrop, but certainly not meant to overshadow the main subject. I watched her from across the room. Grace. Even the name felt sleek, streamlined, and perfectly polished. She was a sculpture carved from ambition, all sharp cheekbones, tailored silk, and an impenetrable smile. She wasn't just beautiful. She was the embodiment of the successful modern woman, and every single person in the room, from the CEO to the junior analysts, knew it. Our life lately had felt less like a partnership and more like a carefully curated exhibit, with Grace as the masterpiece and me as the velvet rope keeping the public, and apparently me, at a respectful distance. My internal clock, the one tuned to her rhythms, told me the heavy-hitting client discussions were winding down. It was my cue. As her husband, my role was simple. Be present, be supportive, and look suitably proud, which was genuinely easy to do. I squared my shoulders, smoothed the lapel of my tuxedo, the one she insisted on for optimal presentation, and began my careful navigation through the clusters of power brokers and designer gowns. I saw her talking to Mr. Alastair, a man whose handshake could reportedly seal multi-million-dollar deals. Grace was laughing, a controlled melodic sound that never reached her eyes, which remained laser-focused on Alastair's reaction. When Alastair finally excused himself, I seized the moment. "You crushed it, honey," I murmured, approaching her. Alastair looked like he was ready to sign over his firstborn. Grace's smile tightened slightly, shifting from the professional glow to the polite, husband-adjacent setting. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, her eyes sweeping the crowd, checking for the next interaction. "It's about presentation, Thomas. Knowing how to read the room. Alastair respects confidence, not theatrics." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. My heart gave a little hopeful thump. It wasn't a grand gesture I sought, just a brief flicker of us, a reminder that under the silk and ambition, she was still my wife. I moved closer to her back, my hand rising slowly. It was a gesture born of instinct, one I performed 1,000 times in 1,000 different settings. In kitchens, on sofas, crossing streets. I intended to rest my hand lightly on the small of her back, a non-verbal anchor that said, "I see you and I'm here." It was my silent way of giving her strength. The moment my fingertips brushed the silk of her dress, I felt her body flinch. It wasn't a visible shudder, but a minuscule tension, a microscopic shift in her posture that only I, the man who knew the precise rhythm of her breath, could detect. She didn't turn to me. She didn't drop her gaze. Instead, she smoothly pivoted one step to her left, ostensibly to admire a piece of modern art hanging ironically close to the emergency exit sign. "Oh, Thomas," she said, her voice dropping to a low, quick whisper that barely carried over the ambient hum of conversation. Her tone was sharp, like the snap of a rubber band. "Please don't. I don't like being the center of attention unnecessarily. This is not professional." My hand, which had been offering support, was now left dangling in the expensive air, feeling suddenly heavy and utterly ridiculous. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but the heat of a silent, slow burn was creeping up the back of my neck. "Unnecessarily? Grace, I was just—" "I know what you were doing," she cut in, her eyes momentarily flicking to mine, delivering a cold, hard glare that somehow contained a lifetime of judgment. "Being overly affectionate. We are here to network, to solidify my position, not to put on a clumsy display of domestic bliss. It looks desperate, Thomas. Don't be so excessive in front of these people." The word excessive landed like a tiny, poisoned dart. It stripped the gesture of its love and rendered it a fault, a social misstep on my part. The sting wasn't the rejection itself. I'd grown used to the subtle deflections. The sting was the reason. It wasn't "I'm busy" or "I'm tired." It was always about the image. about the risk of being perceived as anything less than the flawless, self-contained corporate entity she had built herself up to be. My affection, my need for connection, was a flaw in her perfect public matrix. I slowly dropped my hand to my side, curling my fingers into a loose, empty fist. I felt the warmth of the room recede, leaving me in a pocket of icy detachment. I was not angry. Anger required energy and investment, and I was suddenly drained of both. The overriding emotion was a profound emptiness. "Right," I managed, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "My mistake. I'll step back." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice already regaining its smooth, professional timbre as she turned her attention to a passing associate. It was a dismissal, clean and surgical. She didn't even notice the small, broken piece of me I left behind on the polished marble floor. I retreated, seeking the anonymous safety of the bar area. I ordered a neat whiskey, the burn a welcome distraction from the chill in my chest. I watched her from a distance, feeling less like her husband and more like an observer of a magnificent, intimidating spectacle. Grace. She was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. We had met in university. She was already driven. I was already the slightly more laid-back anchor. I was the one who could make her laugh without her worry about who was watching. I loved the woman beneath the armor, the one who would devour a tub of ice cream in her pajamas while watching terrible reality TV. But that woman lately was only visible in brief, exhausted moments before she fell asleep, and never ever when the spotlight was on. My career was different. I was a software architect, dealing in logic, code, and systems. My success was measured by efficiency, not perception. I didn't need to perform for the crowd. My work spoke for itself. This contrast was becoming the fault line in our marriage. Grace saw my laid-back approach as a lack of ambition. I saw her constant performance as a form of emotional starvation. The problem, I realized tonight more acutely than ever, was that she didn't just reject the public display of affection. She rejected the validation that came with it. That simple hand on her back wasn't just physical contact. It was a statement that she was loved, supported, and didn't have to carry the entire professional weight alone. But she seemed to have misinterpreted that support as weakness, as a declaration that she needed me. I nursed my whiskey, watching her work the room with the practiced grace of a seasoned diplomat. She was thriving, but she was doing it completely alone, sealed off by her need for public perfection. The worst part of the rejection wasn't the sting. It was the inevitable reaction it triggered in me: withdrawal. Why try to offer connection if it was consistently catalogued as a social error? Why reach out only to be reminded that my touch was excessive? From that night forward, something in me fundamentally shifted. I stopped looking for those small moments. I stopped reaching out in public. I stopped trying to break through the perfect, shimmering glass wall she had erected around herself. I began to practice the distance she preached. When we were out, I smiled politely, nodded on cue, and stayed firmly in my orbit, careful not to cross into her gravitational pull. I became the ideal husband she needed for her image. Handsome, silent, and entirely unchallenging. The silence grew between us, not a noisy silence of argument, but a quiet, insidious one. The silence of two people who no longer knew how to talk about the things that mattered, because the thing that mattered most was her control over perception. I thought back to a conversation we'd had a few weeks prior, shortly after she got the promotion. I had gently pointed out that she seemed less happy, despite the career win. "Thomas," she'd sighed, exasperated, peeling off her power blazer in the hallway. "Happiness isn't the goal. Success is. You of all people should understand that. I don't need your ideal husband validation, or your pity, or your emotional commentary. I need you to be my partner and trust my process." "I don't need your ideal husband validation," she jeered. The words echoed in my mind now, a hollow anthem to our growing separation. She saw my validation as a burden, a crutch she refused to carry. So I let go. I began to build my own emotional space, a quiet, protected corner of my life that her ambition couldn't touch. I threw myself deeper into my work, where code returned predictable results and human connection wasn't a risk. I finished my drink. The ballroom lights began to dim subtly, signaling the final hour. Grace was still talking, still immaculate. I didn't approach her again. I sent a text message, my new preferred form of spousal communication, heading to the car. Let me know when you're done. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the glamour and the distance behind me. The stage was set. Grace had successfully created the space she desired between us and the world, unaware that by pushing me away for the sake of her image, she had inadvertently pushed me toward a point where another person's simple, honest warmth might finally be enough to reawaken the man who was tired of being her supporting player. The next meeting, the one she would not attend, was already on my calendar. And that, I realized with a quiet, terrifying certainty, would be my true moment of reckoning. The distance Grace had so meticulously created in the grand ballroom wasn't just physical. It had become the new normal, a comfortable, insulated emptiness that filled our penthouse apartment. I had become adept at navigating the silence, replacing shared moments with late nights at my desk, drowning myself in algorithms and code. Grace, for her part, seemed oblivious, consumed by the relentless ascent of her career ladder. She had successfully turned our marriage into a sleek, self-managed entity, free from the excessive friction of emotional need. One rainy Tuesday, a month after the incident at the Zenith Tower, I found myself in a different kind of pressure cooker. An informal cross-departmental networking event designed to foster collaboration on a major new fintech integration project. This wasn't Grace's world of black ties and champagne flutes. This was a relaxed, buzzing atmosphere in a loft space, all exposed brick, craft beer, and genuine enthusiasm. I arrived feeling my usual armor of professional detachment. My goal was simple: execute my technical pitch, secure the necessary resources, and retreat to my silent sanctuary. I had just finished presenting the technical challenges of integrating our legacy system, a particularly dense topic, when I heard a bright, unfiltered laugh right behind me. Wow, Thomas. You managed to make legacy system integration sound almost exciting. That deserves an award, a voice said. I turned to see Santi. Santi was one of the lead project managers from the finance side. She wasn't an acquaintance of Grace's. She was from a different, less image-obsessed sector. She had an infectious, easygoing energy, a stark contrast to the guarded perfection I was used to. Her smile was wide and genuine, crinkling the corners of her eyes. She wore a simple, professional dress that actually looked comfortable, and her laughter felt like a refreshing summer storm, loud, cleansing, and entirely uncensored. That's high praise coming from the person who has to manage the budget for this monstrosity, I replied, a small, involuntary smile tugging at my lips. It had been a long time since I'd felt the need to genuinely smile in a work setting. Oh, the budget is just a numbers puzzle, Santi waved dismissively. The real puzzle is making sure the human element connects. You know, making sure the code speaks to the user, not just the server. She leaned closer conspiratorially, lowering her voice slightly, but still radiating warmth. You looked genuinely exhausted explaining the API structure. Are you running on coffee fumes, Thomas? Her directness was startling. Grace would never ask if I was exhausted. She would ask if I was ready for the next meeting. Something like that, I admitted, feeling an immediate, easy comfort. Long nights. You know how it is when you're troubleshooting a phantom bug. Oh, tell me about it. We had a phantom decimal point last week that nearly sank the entire quarterly report. It was the stuff of nightmares. Santi shuddered playfully, then leaned back. But seriously, you nailed the complexity. I know the rest of the team will be able to build off that clarity. That was a really solid win. She extended her hand for a classic, celebratory high five. I met it instantly, the sharp clap of our hands a brief, invigorating punctuation marked to the stress of the presentation. Thanks, Santi. I appreciate that, I said, a genuine sense of accomplishment washing over me, not because I'd impressed the brass, but because I'd received simple, honest recognition from a peer. Then, fueled by the same authentic energy that had driven her laugh, Santi gave my shoulder a quick, firm, celebratory squeeze. It was the kind of touch you give a teammate after scoring a goal, purely platonic, spontaneous, and utterly, wonderfully warm. Go get some air, Thomas. You earned a break. The touch lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in the echoing chambers of my emotional memory, it felt like an earthquake. It was a completely unfiltered gesture of connection, given freely, without a single thought for who might be watching or what it might look like. It was the antithesis of the stiff, controlled environment I had been existing in. I was mid-sip of my water, still basking in the pleasant glow of the interaction, when my eyes caught Grace's reflection in the glass wall opposite. Grace wasn't supposed to be here. Her office was miles away, her calendar usually a solid block of high-level meetings. But there she was, standing near the entrance of the loft, looking perfectly put together in a camel coat and designer boots. She must have been there to meet a contact, or perhaps was dropping in unannounced on a whim, a power move to check the pulse of an emerging project. I watched her through the reflection, and the sight was chilling. The soft, welcoming expression she was using a moment ago for her contact vaporized. Her face snapped into a rigid mask of disapproval. The easy, professional curve of her lips flattened into a thin, white line. Her eyes, those beautiful, calculating instruments, were fixed on me, or more accurately, on the exact spot where Santi's hand had just rested on my shoulder. There was no discernible flash of romantic jealousy. Grace wasn't insecure in that way. Her reaction was purely a matter of control and ego. She wasn't angry because I was interacting with another woman. She was furious because I was interacting freely with another woman. I had allowed myself a moment of authentic, unplanned warmth, and worse, I had received easy validation from a source she did not control, in a manner she had explicitly branded as excessive. It was a blatant threat to the perfect, sterile image she had of me, the ideal husband who knew his place, who stayed politely in the corner. I saw her say a curt, dismissive sentence to her acquaintance, and then, with the decisive stride of an executioner, she headed straight toward me. "Thomas," she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr as she reached my side. She didn't acknowledge Santi, who was already walking away. What was that? I turned to her, finding the detached calm I had so diligently practiced over the last month. "Hello, Grace. Nice surprise." That was Santi. We just finished presenting. It was a good session. "I don't mean the presentation," she hissed, her eyes blazing with an ice-cold intensity. "I mean that. The casualness. The familiarity. Did you have to be so unprofessional, Thomas?" I raised an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch for a moment. This was it. The moment the pent-up emptiness and the bitterness of the excessive comment could finally be voiced. "Unprofessional," I repeated, my voice quiet, almost bored. "Grace, we just successfully navigated a major technical presentation with another department. We were celebrating a win. It was a high five and a tap on the shoulder. It's called camaraderie. I didn't realize human interaction outside of a rigidly scripted dialogue was a breach of corporate policy." Her jaw clenched. "It was overly familiar. She was touching you. You encouraged it. In a professional setting, Thomas, we maintain boundaries. You know better than to invite that kind of casual display, especially when you know the kind of impression that leaves." The audacity of her statement, the sheer hypocrisy, finally broke the last seal of my emotional withdrawal. I met her gaze, no longer feeling small or ashamed, but simply weary of the constant performance. "And what kind of impression do I usually leave, Grace?" I challenged her softly. "The one you mandate? The perfectly detached one? The one where my own wife flinches away from my hand on her back because it might look unprofessional?" I paused, letting the memory of the Zenith Tower incident hang heavy in the air between us. "You want to talk about displays and boundaries? Let's talk about them," I continued, my voice gaining a steady, undeniable strength. 2 months ago, I tried to give you a simple, loving touch, a wordless reassurance that I was there, and you dismissed me with a whisper because you didn't want to be seen as needing your excessively affectionate husband. You wanted distance. You wanted sterile perfection. My stare did not waver. I leaned in, dropping my voice to her low, dangerous whisper, but mine carried the force of a tectonic shift. "So, tell me, Grace, why are you so angry? Why is her simple, honest touch, a touch of professional respect, a problem for you when you rejected mine? Why are you angry that I received a flicker of warmth from someone else when you're the one who deliberately extinguished mine?" Her perfect mask wavered. Her eyes widened, not with guilt, but with a shock of pure, naked frustration. She hadn't anticipated the blowback. She had expected compliance, or at least a quiet, defensive retreat. "That is entirely different," she spluttered, fighting to regain control of the narrative. "That was intimacy in a professional space. This is what, Grace?" I cut her off. "This is genuine interaction. It's a spontaneous moment that didn't require a script or a worry about public perception. You were right about one thing at the Zenith Tower. I don't need your ideal husband validation. But you clearly still need my adherence to your image. And I am done adhering." I stepped back, physically separating myself from her sudden, controlling proximity. I finally understood the core of her reaction. It wasn't about the touch itself. It was about her sense of entitlement to my emotional energy. She assumed that if anyone was to receive my sincere warmth, it had to be her, even if she had no intention of accepting it. She was outraged that my attention, the validation she claimed not to need, was being given to a casual acquaintance who appreciated it, while she, the main event, was being ignored. "I'm leaving, Grace," I stated flatly, retrieving my coat. "I've completed my work here. You can stay and manage the optics of my departure, but I'm going home. And when you get there, you and I are going to talk about this space you wanted so badly, because I think you just realized what it feels like when it actually becomes real." I walked away without waiting for her reply, leaving her standing alone in the sleek, modern loft. The air around her was suddenly thinner, colder. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of my own autonomy return. The distance was no longer just her creation. It was now a boundary I was enforcing. And the silent, genuine warmth from a coworker's spontaneous gesture had served as the unexpected, powerful catalyst for my long-overdue emotional break. I drove home through the city's neon arteries, the heavy rain outside mirroring the emotional storm I had just unleashed. The confrontation with Grace hadn't felt like an argument. It felt like a declaration of independence. My words, delivered with a calm, surgical precision that stemmed from months of suppressed hurt, had finally pierced her shield. The quiet confidence I felt wasn't victory. It was the eerie stillness that follows a tremor, the relief of release mixed with the fear of the ensuing collapse. When I reached the penthouse, the apartment felt vast and silent, echoing the hollowed-out space that had grown between us. I changed into casual clothes, poured myself a drink, and sat by the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color. I wasn't waiting for Grace. I was simply waiting for the inevitable consequence of my honesty. It was nearly 2 hours later when I heard the distinct click of the electronic lock. Grace walked in, her composure regained but visibly strained. The camel coat was off, the silk dress slightly rumpled, a tiny imperfection in her usually flawless presentation. This was not the icy corporate queen. This was a woman who had been shaken, perhaps not by the depth of my hurt, but certainly by the unexpected loss of her control over me. She found me by the window. She didn't launch into an attack or demand an apology. Instead, she performed a soft landing, a calculated move that felt more unsettling than her previous fury. "Thomas," she began, her voice low, almost pleading. "We need to talk. Properly." "I thought we just did," I replied, not turning my head, keeping my focus on the mesmerizing cascade of rain on the glass. "No, that was a reaction." "Both of us," she said, taking a tentative step closer. "Look, I know what you said about the party. About my reaction." I finally turned to face her, my expression deliberately neutral. "You called my attempt at connection excessive. You saw my spontaneity with a coworker as unprofessional. I'm not sure what there is to clarify, Grace. Your stance was very clear." She sat on the edge of the nearby armchair, avoiding my direct gaze. I was under pressure, Thomas. That whole evening was critical. Every move, every glance, is calculated. If I let my guard down, even for a second, you lose the image, I finished for her gently. The perfect, untouchable director. I get it, Grace. I always have. But you confuse the image you need for the public with the reality you need at home. You asked me to keep my distance, and now I have. Silence descended, heavier this time. Grace shifted, fiddling with a delicate silver bracelet on her wrist. Then, she tried a new tactic. A softer, warmer approach. She stood up and moved towards me, not in a rush, but with an almost studied slowness. When she reached me, she did something she hadn't done in months. She reached out and gently placed her hand on my arm. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered, her eyes finally finding mine, searching. "I know I've been difficult. I have pushed you away. I have been so focused on proving my worth to the outside world that I forgot the worth of what I have here." She even managed to produce a slight catch in her voice. "Seeing you so easily connected to someone else, even platonically, it was a strange kind of shock. It made me realize how much I took your presence, your unconditional support, for granted." I looked down at her hand on my arm. It was a beautiful, slender hand, perfectly manicured. It was a gesture of intimacy, the very thing she had deemed inappropriate just weeks earlier. And here was the crux of the matter. I felt nothing. No surge of relief, no spark of hope, no lingering anger. There was only a quiet, unnerving void. Her touch felt exactly like her apology, compelled. It wasn't driven by genuine yearning love. It was driven by the terrifying realization that her actions had consequences that extended beyond a momentary awkwardness. It was the fear of losing control over her environment. The sudden, horrifying discovery that the supportive background character me had found a new stage and might just walk off hers entirely. She wasn't fighting for my heart. She was fighting for the integrity of her perfect life story. "Grace," I said, my voice level, removing her hand from my arm with deliberate gentleness. "I hear you. And I appreciate the apology. But I don't think you realize what you're apologizing for. You're sorry that I noticed the distance, not that you created it." She recoiled slightly, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What do you mean? I just told you I took you for granted." "You did," I conceded. "But why did you suddenly realize that? Was it a quiet moment of reflection? Or was it when you saw Santi place her hand on my shoulder? Was it a realization of love lost, or a fear of ego wounded? You didn't want my affection when it was freely offered. You only want it back now that someone else has easily received a fraction of it." The truth hung between us, thick and uncomfortable. Grace had built a kingdom where she was queen, and the moment she saw one of her prized subjects showing loyalty to another flag, she panicked. Over the next few weeks, she tried harder. She initiated dates, not business dinners, but actual romantic attempts. She was softer, more attentive, and she even began using non-verbal cues in public. A shared glance, a brief hand squeeze, gestures that she previously would have executed me for. I went along with it. I was polite, engaged, and outwardly responsive. I became the ideal husband she now desperately needed, but this time, the performance was mine. I was present, but emotionally absent. This internal state was the quiet end. I had completely detached. The constant cycle of trying, failing, and hurting had stopped. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger meant I still cared enough about her choices to fight them. Now, I simply observed her efforts with a kind of benevolent neutrality. One night, we were lying in bed. Grace was nestled against me, something that had become a regular occurrence since the confrontation. She sighed contentedly. "This is better, Thomas," she murmured into my chest. "We're finding our way back, aren't we?" I looked up at the ceiling. The ceiling fan was rotating, casting slow, hypnotic shadows. "We are finding a way, Grace," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "We are establishing a new protocol." "Don't be cold," she protested, raising her head to look at me. "I'm not cold," I corrected her softly. "I'm just quiet. You asked for distance, Grace. You wanted the space. And you got it. Now that space isn't just external. It's here." I tapped my own chest lightly, right over my heart. "You succeeded in creating the immaculate, controlled distance you wanted. It's quiet, it's organized, and it requires nothing from me but my presence." She suddenly looked terrified, the realization dawning in her eyes that this quiet, compliant man beside her was no longer the passionate, fighting husband she had so confidently dismissed. "But I want you back," she whispered, her voice cracking with genuine fear. "I want us back. I want the fight, the laughter, the The excessive love. I want you to be the one who reaches out. I finally turned to her, placing a hand on her cheek. It was a tender gesture, but it felt like the hand of a stranger offering comfort. You can't just turn off and on a person's ability to risk being hurt, Grace, I told her, my voice heavy with a truth I couldn't undo. You spent months conditioning me to believe that my love was a liability to your image, that my need for connection was weak. I learned the lesson. I pulled back my energy, my emotions, my vulnerability. I am not angry anymore, Grace. I am simply released. I am no longer fighting for your validation because I don't need it. I don't need your permission to be the ideal husband, because that term, for you, only meant invisible husband. She began to cry, silent tears tracking down her perfect skin. They weren't the dramatic tears of a woman losing an argument, but the quiet, genuine tears of a woman realizing she had traded gold for polished brass. She had won the battle for professional perfection but lost the war for true intimacy. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small, a sound I hadn't heard from her since the early days of our relationship. "We stop pretending," I said. "You've gained the distance you sought. Now, the real question is, are you brave enough to cross it? Because I won't be the one crossing first anymore. I am here, but you have to prove that the Grace who is reaching out is real, and not just afraid of losing her reflection in the mirror." The silence that followed was neither hostile nor loving. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a vast empty field where something new, something fragile, was about to be planted. I was no longer the angry, rejected husband. I was the patient, detached observer. The quiet end to the old marriage had arrived, and the future depended entirely on whether Grace was willing to dismantle her fortress, brick by polished brick, and risk being seen, truly seen, without her protective walls. The ensuing weeks were a delicate, nerve-wracking exercise in rebuilding a structure where the foundations had been quietly eroding for years. I had drawn my line in the sand. I was no longer fighting to prove my worth or chasing her affection. I was simply waiting to see if the real Grace could emerge from the shell of the perfect director. My state of detachment, far from being cruel, was simply necessary. It was my immune system protecting itself from further infection. Grace understood the gravity of my silence. My calmness was more terrifying to her than my anger. Anger she could fight, silence she had to fill. And she began to fill it, not with the superficial gestures of the previous weeks, but with concrete actions that chipped away at her image-obsessed existence. The first significant shift occurred not in a grand romantic gesture, but in the mundane logistics of our lives. Grace, who usually delegated everything from grocery orders to dry cleaning, canceled her assistant's personal tasks. One Saturday morning, she walked into the kitchen wearing a pair of old, faded jeans, a sight I hadn't witnessed in years, and found me making coffee. "Morning," she said, her voice sounding oddly tentative. She didn't launch into a recap of her schedule or a check-in on the status of our weekend plans. "Morning," I replied, watching her carefully. She walked over to the cabinet, pulled out a box of cereal, and then paused, looking utterly lost. "Where do we keep the big bowls again? The ones for soup?" I chuckled, a genuine unrehearsed sound that surprised both of us. "We don't use the soup bowls for cereal, Grace. The cereal bowls are the ones with the blue rim, third shelf down." "Right. Of course." She retrieved the correct bowl, but instead of retreating, she sat down at the kitchen island, not facing her phone, but facing me. I fired my personal assistant from doing my home errands, Thomas. Not the work one, just the home one. It felt ridiculous that someone else knew where our soup bowls were and I didn't. It was a small admission, a microscopic victory against the machine of perfection she had built. "That's a start," I said, handing her a mug of coffee. She took a slow sip, savoring the warmth. "It's more than a start. It's an acknowledgement that I outsourced my life to protect my image, and in the process, I outsourced you." She looked up, her gaze steady, without the searching fear of the previous chapter, but with a quiet resolve. "I realize I created a world where I needed you to be silent and perfect so I could be loud and perfect. That's not a partnership, it's a prop." From that point, her efforts became an earnest, slow dismantling of the emotional distance. She began leaving her phone in the bedroom during dinner. She canceled non-essential weekend networking events, choosing instead to stay home. She didn't ask me to tell her about my day. She told me about hers, the mundane, frustrating parts, including a moment where she spilled coffee on a major contract, the kind of imperfection she previously would have kept hidden under layers of professional bravado. The critical turning point, however, came during a business trip she took to the West Coast. Grace had always maintained strict professional boundaries during her trips. Calls were short, focused on logistics, and never, ever initiated by me. This time, she called me unexpectedly on a Thursday evening, local time. "Thomas," she asked, her voice sounding tired and thin through the receiver. "Grace, everything all right? Is the presentation okay?" I asked immediately, my old programming kicking in, concern for her professional well-being. "The presentation was fine," she sighed. "It was good, actually. They loved the proposal. But I'm alone in the hotel room now, and I just realized. I got the win, but I have no one to really tell. No one to share the relief with. My colleagues are celebrating at the bar, but I just needed to hear your voice." Her admission was a vulnerability I hadn't witnessed in years. It wasn't about her ego needing validation. It was about her soul needing connection. She was admitting a dependence, not on my performance, but on my simple presence. "I'm here," I said, a warmth I thought long dead stirring in my chest. "Tell me everything. Tell me the relief." She did. We talked for an hour, not about work strategies, but about the silly small details. The ridiculous hotel art, the terrible quality of the complimentary tea, and the sheer mental exhaustion of maintaining her director mask for 3 days straight. It was a conversation we might have had 7 years ago, back when our only concern was which cheap takeout place to order from. When the conversation ended, I realized the emptiness inside me had finally begun to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of hope. The emotional frost I had endured was beginning to melt, drop by slow drop. A week after she returned, Grace initiated the talk again, but this time, it was different. She didn't look polished, she looked human. We were sitting on the couch, the television off, the quiet comforting rather than isolating. "I need to be absolutely honest with you, Thomas," she said, turning to face me completely. "The day I saw Santi touch your shoulder, I wasn't just angry because it was unprofessional. I was furious because the ease with which you accepted that touch told me everything I had lost. I had spent so long pushing away your genuine affection, branding it as a weakness, that when I saw you receive a flicker of non-professional warmth from someone else, I realized I had taught you how to live without mine." She reached out and took my hands, her touch firm, present, and free from the cautious, studied approach of Chapter 3. "I wasn't afraid of losing you to her. I was terrified of losing the man who used to look at me with unguarded love," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted the distance because I thought being distant meant being powerful. But all it did was make me lonely, Thomas. I don't need the ideal husband validation. I need you. The man who can make me laugh without caring who's watching. The man who brings me back down to earth when I get too high on my own performance." This was the honesty I had been waiting for. This was the vulnerable, flawed woman I had fallen in love with, finally emerging from behind the fortress walls. "It took me almost losing you to realize that," she continued, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "I traded real, messy, excessive love for a perfect, sterile picture. I want to trade back." I squeezed her hands, feeling the rush of emotion. Not bitterness, not anger, but a profound, overwhelming relief. The emotional distance was officially closed. "I'm still here, Grace," I told her, my own voice husky. "I was always here. But I can't be the only one fighting for us. You have to keep crossing that distance you created." "I will," she vowed, her eyes shining with commitment. "Every day." And she did. The happy ending wasn't a sudden fix. It was a slow, deliberate act of choosing connection over image, day after day. Grace didn't suddenly quit her high-powered job, but she redefined success. She set boundaries with her work that protected our time. We started a new ritual, a phone-free 20 minutes every evening where we simply sat together and talked about the weather, a funny dog we saw, or nothing at all. Just enjoying the space we now shared. 3 months later, we attended another corporate event, this time a relaxed charity auction. Grace looked stunning, as always, but something was fundamentally different. As we were walking through the crowded room, I didn't reach for her hand, but she reached for mine, her fingers interlacing with mine, a subtle, confident gesture. Then she looked at me, not with the professional glaze I was accustomed to, but with the warm, unguarded love of the woman who knew my every flaw and loved me more for it. "Thomas," she said, her voice clear and carrying just enough for me to hear. She leaned close, no longer worrying about being unprofessional. "Thank you for not leaving me in that fortress." I smiled, squeezing her hand in return, a simple, genuine connection that required no thought and no script. The journey taught us the hardest lesson of all, that true love isn't found on the stage, applauded by strangers, but in the quiet, messy, imperfect moments behind the curtains. Grace finally got the distance she desired, but she used that empty space to find her way back, dismantling her perfection and choosing the real, messy life we could share. We will always have the pressures of the world, but now, when my hand finds hers, I know we are no longer playing to the crowd. We are simply home. And that, after all the distance, is the best happy ending I could ever ask for.